Welcome to Qualified Opinions, where we test the ideas and limits, the knowns and known unknowns around freedom and order in contemporary politics and society. We invite you to listen as we engage with leading and emerging thinkers across disciplines and issues who will sharpen our thinking on the topics shaping our discourse. Welcome back. Today we're diving into a topic that's been making wave in the American workforce and the American political landscape, the state and future of labor unions. With union memberships hitting historic lows in recent decades, but also seeing some high-profile victory and renewed interest among young workers, we're at an interesting crossroad in the labor movement. So today I'm happy to have Vinnie Vernuccio, a seasoned labor attorney, an expert on unions, to talk about really all things unions. Vinnie is the president and co-founder of the Institute for American Workers, or I4AW, very union-sounding name. Vinnie will help us unpack the trend, challenges, and potential futures for union in our rapidly evolving economy. We'll explore questions like, are we actually seeing a union renaissance, or are union adapting to the gig economy and automation, and what that might mean for the American workplace? Welcome, Vinnie.
Well, hey, thanks for having me on. And, I think this is the first time we've done official media together, but I know we've been in, several meetings, and it's always great working with you.
Yeah. So to start, just tell us a little bit about yourself. How did you end up, where you are doing what you do?
Unfortunately, I started like a lot of right of center labor policy wonks start. I got a job at the Department of Labor. And my boss put a stack of papers on my desk and said, hey, I want you to read this, learn this, and then we'll talk about what you're doing. And a lot of it was self-taught. And one of the reasons that I founded I4AW is to kind of standardize free market labor policy and labor briefings and get folks, from, former to future administration officials, Hill staff, people at think tanks, give them a real grounding on federal labor policy, what it means, and where we can go as a free market movement to bring full freedom to workers all across the country.
And you were in politics for a while?
So I've had two presidential appointments. I was on President Trump's transition team. I served on the Federal Service Impasses panel under President Trump. I got my start in the Bush administration at the Department of Labor. That's where that story came from. And I've worked with think tanks across the country, from the Competitive Enterprise Institute to the Mackinac Center, State Policy Network, and then I founded Institute for the American Worker.
And so let's dive into the union landscape. So, it's interesting because there's been a lot of activity on the union front. We've seen a lot of strikes for the last 2 years, really, like big scale strike, and what looks like big union victories. But the also big development in the political world is that while unions were mostly a thing of the left, there's been some movement on the right among Republicans to taking the union mental. And so, and I think that's driven by the move towards populism, but so, and being pro-worker, right? It's like Republicans want to say they're really pro-worker. So do unions really translate into a better deal for workers? Are unions pro-workers?
Well, let's dwell on that pro-worker concept. And yes, Republicans have always been pro-worker.
Yes.
It's pro-worker to give workers a choice whether or not to support a union. And, that's the kind of hallmark Republican labor policy is right to work. And, what right to work means is that a union can't get a worker fired for not paying them. And, that has been kind of the hallmark pro-worker Republican policy that, unfortunately, we're seeing just, a very small minority. And by minority, I mean like only one or two Republican politicians at the federal level starting to back away away from that.
But I mean, there was a union boss at the National Republican Convention, which was the first time in a long time, right?
Yeah, let's talk about Sean O'Brien's speech. President Trump, former President Trump, and the RNC gave O'Brien a chance, and he whiffed it. I was hoping, I wasn't hopeful, but I was hoping to hear, since he was talking to Republicans, that, he would come out and, support pro-worker policies that bring freedom and choice to workers around the country. I know we're going to talk about the gig economy and things like that. But instead, he just doubled down on the typical big labor talking points and gave a speech that, frankly, could have been met with resounding applause at the DNC. And here's where I think things get really interesting. I think that speech was the high watermark for these labor-curious conservatives. And it's been receding since then. And you just look at what's happened to Sean O'Brien since he gave that speech. Once again, a speech full of nothing but Democrat, left-leaning, big labor talking points. And, he has been essentially excommunicated from the left's labor folks for the sin of even talking to Republicans. And you even see within his own unions, now he's facing a challenge to his presidency. And I think that really speaks volumes for those on the right that say, oh, we can start kowtowing to union leadership. We can give into these left-leaning, anti-free market, compulsory union demands, as opposed to just speaking directly to workers and giving them what they want and speaking their language, which I think President Trump has done very well throughout his career.
So I want to explore this notion that this idea of whether or not unions are pro workers, because if you ask people, there's this kind of I think polls show roughly 70% of Americans say they have a favorable opinion of workers and of unions. And I assume that it's because in their mind, whether they would themselves join a union or not, which usually they won't, they kind of associate unions with the ability to deliver benefits. So is that the case? So first, what are unions claiming they can deliver for workers that workers can't get for themselves? Again, we're in the kind of, what are they claiming?
Okay. Well, what they're claiming is that they need more power and they need to force more workers, take away choice from workers, allow for things like card check, which allows for intimidation and coercion, or at the very least, simply taking away workers' ability to make an informed choice by hearing all sides of the story.
So what is card check exactly?
Okay, so card check is this open petition process where a union official can come to, your house or at your job in front of your colleagues, say, hey, sign this card. And, a lot of times those cards can say something like, sign up for this pizza party, or simply sign up for this raffle, or to get more information on the union. And what the organizer doesn't say, but what's in usually, very small font at the bottom is, I hereby authorize the union to represent me. And then what the union can do is they can go to the employer and say, we have a majority of these cards signed, recognize us. Then it's up to the employer to say, okay, I'll recognize you and work with you. And usually they'll do that because the unions have done these anti-PR campaigns to pressure them, which, we can talk about in a bit. Or they can say, no, I want a secret ballot election and I want to protect my workers' privacy and choice. And then they can speak to the workers and say, hey, you've heard from the union. This is what we think. This is why we don't think having a union here would be good. Then there's the election and workers get to have a private, informed vote. Unions don't like that. They want to be able to just say, hey, sign this card without any other information. Sometimes they're misleading. Sometimes, one NLRB case, you literally had as the NLRB put it, an overzealous card solicitor, wasn't affiliated with the union, but card solicitor that came and, basically said, hey, that's a nice car you have in the driveway. Shame if anything happened to it. Sign this card here. And unfortunately, in Congress, you have bills like the PRO Act and what we're also seeing through the Biden administration, through his National Labor Relations Board is they're trying to make that process much easier. And in fact, even give unions the ability to throw out elections and then just have them recognized by this card check method if they can accuse the employer of doing something and a very biased NLRB says, yeah, you did something wrong, so we're just recognizing the union.
So what are the unions saying to workers who sign these cards that they're going to do for them once they come to this meeting? What is their claim of achievement?
And I mean, that's the problem, because they can promise workers the moon and there's no check on that. So they can say, hey, sign with us, and they'll talk about wage hikes or better benefits. In some cases, and I'm thinking of things like Starbucks, Trader Joe's. One way they are appealing to some of the younger workers is not even talking about wages or benefits, but saying, we don't like Israel, we support Palestine, make a political statement by joining us. So some of it is just raw politics as well that they're trying to sell.
Mm-hmm. I saw a tweet by Robert Reich recently that a lot of people have commented on, where he said this is why unions are great. And he credited union historically for the reduction of work hours, work week hours, paid leave. What else? I mean, there was just a long list of things, but I think that's kind of, it's not true, right? I mean, it's, if I remember my history correctly, I mean, unions are not really responsible for this.
There's a lot of back and forth. The classic example is, unions created the weekend, but then you look back and you see the real time that, the 40-hour work week and overtime pay, and that really started was with Henry Ford. And he saw that, in order to attract top talent, in order to keep productivity high, he had to give workers a rest. And, and Henry Ford actually instituted these type of policies before the government mandated it.
I think 1926 was Ford implementing the 40-hour work week. And the story I'd heard, and I don't know if it's true, is that he thought if people were free on the weekend, they'd have more time to come and buy his cars. But I don't know if it's
that is one of the rumors. Yes, it's hey, give them time off so they can spend more money on my products.
Yeah, and so when Roosevelt, because I always think about Roosevelt is like the one who's credited for creating all these great things for unions. But as is often the case, it seemed that basically the companies were already doing all sorts of pro-worker things because they realized it was in their benefits to do so. And then when the government steps in and effectively just kind of enshrine in regulations something that has already happened. The problem when the government does this is like it creates a lot of restriction anyway. So it's kind of, so what did Roosevelt do exactly? What kind of legislations did he pass that enshrine all these progress, like pro-worker things that had been adopted, for...
Yeah, so let's just talk about today. And I want to go back to, your quote about Robert Reich. Almost everything he was talking about that the unions gave us is now enshrined into law. And, like it or not, it kind of diminishes a lot of things that the unions are selling is that, hey, workers have these protections. They're enshrined in law. Why have this union that comes between the employer or my boss and me? And, just want to go back and play devil's advocate here. I mean, I do think that there was a place for unions and that when, unions really started to take off. And I mean, the modern day union movement is, legally, it's from the 1930s. And, you look back to the National Labor Relations Act that is established everything we have, most of what we have in labor law today. That was unions' heydays. Then through the 1950s is when they were, really organizing and expanding. And, that was their playbook and they did a good job. Unfortunately, their playbook hasn't changed until then. And that is the main problem with collective bargaining and organizing today, is you have these unions that were built for the Industrial Revolution, that were built for low-skilled workers in an assembly line where workers are basically interchangeable. And that's really not today's skilled, educated, flexible economy. And I think going to what you were talking about earlier of union membership falling drastically over the last couple of years, it's part and parcel because workers want flexibility. They want to be rewarded for how productive they are, how hard they work. They want to be able to choose, which employer. And we see this with poll after poll in the sharing economy and independent contracting. And unfortunately, that's not what unions are selling today. What unions are selling today is the same type of us versus them adversarial one-size-fits-all relationship that, frankly, may have fit in the Industrial Revolution, but seriously does not fit in today's modern economy.
I heard an interview last week of John Mackey, who is the CEO and co-founder of Whole Foods, and now, he sold a while back, but he was actually talking about how he was pro-unions, but he said he was the model in the US, and I didn't really quite understand what he meant, but I'm thinking about this because of what you just said, was that it was one that was confrontational. There was no, and it didn't have to be this way. It was kind of, so why did union kind of in the US come out to be just confrontational as opposed to collaborative? Is it because of regulations, or is it cultural? Is it because this is how they came up to be and they just haven't evolved? What is it?
Well, I definitely do not think they've evolved. And I think labor law certainly has not evolved. The last change in labor law was from the 1950s. As far as unions being confrontational, that is built into their business model, their organizing plan. That is simply how they operate. I definitely agree with Mackey. I think there is a place for unions, but they need to give up the government-granted training wheels. They need to give up compulsion, and that's forcing employees to accept the representation, forcing employers to bargain with them. If they get away from that and they become professional service organizations that are providing value both for employees and employers, I think they can really thrive. And I actually did an entire study on this with the Mackinac Center, called it Unionization for the 21st Century. And frankly, that's where I would love to see unions go, as professional service organizations that are voluntary and providing value.
So two things. So I want us to, I would love for you to say, to really spell it out. What are the government training wheels that the unions benefits from in a way? What is specifically that actually kind of protects them or allows them to not evolve to really provide a service to modern workers, right?
So it's a combination of what the government does and kind of the, union's business model. First, government grants unions when we talk, I just want to be very specific, mostly talking about the National Labor Relations Act here that applies to almost all private sector unions outside of the railroad and airline industry. So let's just, contain the universe here. What they allow is a thing called exclusive representation. That's the first problem. It's they give the union a monopoly to represent all workers. And we were talking about right to work. Once again, right to work simply means that a union can't get a worker fired for not paying them, but that's where it stops. So yes, I don't have to pay you if I live in the majority of states that are right to work. But if I'm under a union contract, I still have to live by your work rules, your pay scale. Essentially, if you go back to, speaking of Henry Ford, the old joke, you can have a Model T in any color as long as it's black. That's essentially the union context right now. You can negotiate for anything with your employer as long as it's not in the collective bargaining agreement, but everything's in the collective bargaining agreement. So does it mean, let's say you're a worker and somehow you on assembly line and you come up with, I don't know, a way to make things more efficient. Your
boss can't reward you individually for that particular achievement that year unless it goes through the union boss. And I assume just basically get the benefits of that, bonus for everyone. Is that kind of what we're talking about?
That's exactly what we're talking about. Most union contracts create a floor, not just a floor, but a floor and a ceiling. And the only way, in not all, but most union contracts, you can get a raise is by just logging another year on the job, maybe getting a little more education. But that's it. And that employer can't go to you and say, you're doing a great job. You just figured out this widget or this new process that's saving me a ton of money or making me a ton of money. I want to give you a bonus. That's actually illegal. They have to go through the union. And then the union's going to say, no, if you give it to one, you got to give it to everybody. Now,
yeah, and I can imagine that that's not really actually providing an incentive for any unionized worker to actually try to get out of their way to do the best job that they can.
It's not. And, there are some unions that, I think are, at least in that case, not everything, but in that case, doing a good job. You look at sports unions, you look at entertainment unions, and they establish a floor, but there is no ceiling. And, if you have an all-star baseball player or an actor that's grossing billions at the box office, they can be paid, much more than others that aren't. So that objection to merit by the unions, the individual, that is a problem. And that's one of the things that is established by that monopoly bargain. Monopoly bargaining called exclusive representation. We've actually worked with Congress, and Representative Eric Burleson from Missouri has introduced a bill called Workers' Choice that allows workers in those right-to-work states to fully opt out of union representation and act like, the 90+% of the rest of the economy that's not or private sector economy that's not represented by a union. There's also been bills such as the RAISE Act that just simply says, no, you can't have a ceiling. If an employer wants to give a bonus or give an individual worker a raise, they can do that. Those bills are still waiting to be heard in Congress, but unfortunately, unions rail against them because they like having that monopoly and they like having those one-size-fits-all collective bargaining agreements because that is their business model. But unfortunately, I think that's big part of the business model that's holding them back.
So let's talk, actually, we haven't talked yet about can you give us the landscape in the US? How many workers are unionized? Because they seem to be such an important political actor. The fact that we talked about, the union boss, the Teamster boss being at the National Republican Convention. I mean, they're political. They have an oversized political role. So how important are they in the economy, the labor force? So what are the numbers?
Yeah, absolutely. And I'm looking right now at the union membership survey, and this is put out by the Department of Labor's Bureau of Labor Statistics. You're talking in the entire economy, and this is both public and private sector workers. Union membership was 10% in 2023. When you talk about the private sector, and when we're looking at what we just talked about for the federal government, it's only about 6% membership. And, those numbers, give or take on the year, have been falling. The unions will come back and say, oh, well, we grew in the raw number of members. But as far as the membership percentage, it is falling because even as the economy expands, workers, and we see this in polling, may have a respect for unions. They may say, yes, unions are doing a good job and give a favorable survey response to saying, yes, I view unions favorably. But then when they're asked, well, do you want a union at your workplace? Do you want to join one? It's well, hey, maybe not. And I think that is because they have this outdated business model that today's modern workforce is just rejecting. And, we're seeing that all over the country.
How many, what about the public sector?
The public sector is falling as well. Especially membership. You saw with the Janus versus AFSCME decision, and that was several years ago now. Janus essentially brought right to work to public employees across the country. The Supreme Court said that everything that government unions do is inherently political, and when you think about it, it makes sense. If a government union is negotiating over wages, where does that money come from? That's tax dollars. If they're negotiating for a longer or shorter school day, or even how many parking spots the employees gets, what is that? That's public policy. So the Supreme Court said that everything they do is political, and therefore public employees have a First Amendment right to choose whether or not to pay the union. And after that, we are seeing union membership across the country in the public sector dropping dramatically.
So what share of federal employee, I don't know if you can break it down this way, are unionized versus and in the states? I assume that most of the public employees are at the state level, probably because of, I assume, teacher unions. Is that the case?
Well, it's not just teachers unions. You were talking about, a lot of bureaucrats, transit workers, and a lot of others. But to answer your question specifically, the public sector, about 32.5% are union members. And, both that number, and I also don't want to confuse with the private sector number, those are dues paying union members. The number of workers or the percentage of workers that the union represents is about 36% in the public sector and 6.9% in the private sector. So you're probably asking, well, okay, wait, I just said that union membership was 6%. Where does the 6.9% come from? Where does that difference of 32% versus 36% come from? And that's, once again, those workers that are stuck under the union contract that are represented by the union versus those that are actually dues paying members and want to be part of the union or are considered themselves union members and are dues paying. So unions represent, a small number more than are actually union members. And the difference is those are people in right to work states or the public sector that have fully dropped out and are not paying dues, or in non-right to work states for private sector workers, those that are paying what are known as agency fees, which are, frankly, the vast majority of union dues anyway.
So I actually have a fundamental problem with union for public workers. And I think they should be legal. In that sense, I guess that's maybe the one thing where Franklin Roosevelt and I
you beat me to it. I was about to pull out the FDR quote and say, "Wow, you're agreeing with Franklin Roosevelt."
But actually, if you have that quote, it's. But my reasoning is that they're basically negotiating with people who have more of an incentive to give them what they want than those who are actually going to be shouldering the burden, which is taxpayers. It's like basically when they're negotiating higher wages, less work, whatever it is they're negotiating, ultimately at the negotiation table are none of the people who are going to actually be, paying for the cost. And I think that's just wrong. And obviously I have major issues with private sector workers, mostly because of the way they operate and how they are basic, as you've explained, right? They are like, a lot of their model is compulsory, and I'm absolutely against this. But at the very least, right, the people they squeeze are at the negotiating table.
There is absolutely different incentives. You're right that a lot of, what we're seeing with the public sector is that, essentially they can elect who's on the other side of the negotiating table. In the private sector, you are, that's just simply not the case. They may have the company captured. You may have a company that, it is used to, let's say, kind of the happy, fluffy bunny, touchy-feely, European unions, and they agree to something like card check. But, they do have more skin in the game than we do see with the public sector, where a lot of them are, if you look at Illinois or especially the Chicago Teachers Union and the Chicago mayor, he knows how he got elected. And that was because of the unions.
So they represent very few workers, like 10% of the American workforce, right? But then they yield this enormous political power. And that's because they have a lot of money. Where do they derive their money from? I guess
it's a combination of money and manpower.
Okay.
So, the money comes from a couple places. First, some of it comes from forced dues, those non-right to work states, where, yes, you don't have to pay, the full dues. You have to pay these agency fees, but, money is fungible. And while, they can't use those agency fees to give directly to candidates, they can, use it for other purposes. But a lot of it comes from dues. A lot of it comes from, kind of the peer pressure political action committee. You remember, sign this other or check this other box to give to our PAC. But a lot of it is just simply get out the vote. And to unions' credit, they are very good about that. They are very good about mobilizing their members or having their members mobilize and, come out on election day. Now, what's interesting, though, is that, going back to, former President Trump, you see in the last couple elections, and I think this is where there's some misconceptions about union leadership and the rank and file workers. President Trump did very, very well among especially hard hat union members and your rank and file workers. Now, the reason I think he did so well with them is, he grew up on, he made his career in, New York real estate, worked on job sites. He speaks their language. There were other, trade policies that he was for. But I think that is a big reason why he overperformed and did very well among those union workers. Unfortunately, that's being misconstrued today as, now we have to kowtow to union leadership.
So that's kind of an interesting point because the union leaderships, they're mostly Democratic, right? They're Democrats, like most, I can't remember the number, but an enormous amount of political donation from unions, which is significant because I think they're at the top of the political donations in the US. Like everyone goes and talk about Soros and Koch and all of this, but really unions are like top political donors. They mostly give their money to Democrats, but not every union member is a Democrat, right? So can you remind us the numbers and the proportions?
Yeah, well, let's stick with Sean O'Brien. So the Center for Union Facts actually looked at Teamsters' overall giving. And we're not talking about political action committee, we're just talking about dues. But the Teamsters' dues used for politics and, whether that's direct political, whether that is simply giving to left-leaning organizations or left-leaning media, 99% went to the left.
Yeah.
Now, when you look at polling, and once again, this is not union membership, but union households, typically about a third to 40% vote Republican.
Oh, okay. Yeah.
So when you see, a third to 40% voting one way, but 99% of that money going the other, something is wrong there.
Yeah. So have we ever seen union members revolt against their leadership? Does this ever happen?
We have recently at, certain unions for, issues like corruption. And unfortunately, they get rid of one corrupt leader and now the next leader is under investigation for corruption as well. But when it comes to politics, you do see that sometimes. You see that more with like individual union members. So for instance, we are Institute for the American Worker. We are grounded in pro-worker policy and what's best for those individual workers. Because of which our chairman, a guy by the name of Terry Bowman, is actually a current worker on the line at Ford. And when I founded I4AW, I thought it was very important to have his perspective and his voice. Now, he was the face of right to work in Michigan. I've testified with him all over the country. But what really switched his idea from being a UAW member, and what kind of was the straw that broke the camel's back, was UAW left-leaning politics.
Okay.
Because Terry is right-wing, he is Republican, and where he just said enough is enough is getting UAW flyers that were completely left-leaning and left-wing. And that's why he is so involved now.
And to circle back to what you were saying at the top of our conversation, and which I never really thought about, is like when a lot of the worker achievements have already been achieved, mostly through the capitalist system, but also, I mean, let's give credit to the unions at some point in times. Basically, all they're really doing is politics. And when that politics on the top is really left leaning, and so many of their workers are not, I mean, 40% or even 35% is not insignificant. I can see how that becomes really problematic, where you have these union leaders who are just basically shoving down your face politics that you don't care for. But here, talking about kind of actually politics you don't care for, this is one of the things that I actually worry about. And that is that when you have a very strongly involved union leadership and you have a small percentage of the workforce that is unionized, and especially with the rise of, I mean, I take your point. I mean, it's very few Republicans who are actually making noise about being pro-union. What I worry could happen is that in order to prevent the sliding down to a lower share of workers being unionized, they're going to use really the power of the government to try to mandate membership. And could they do this at the federal level? Could that happen?
Well, they can't mandate membership, but they can mandate, once again, the difference between being a member and being represented. They are trying that. And you're seeing a lot.
So that's the PRO Act?
That is the PRO Act. Yep.
Can you explain what that is? And
So the PRO Act is essentially the smorgasbord of bad ideas from unions and the left. It has several different provisions. We've already talked about the essentially backdoor card check provision that would allow the NLRB to essentially throw out an election, give workers a head fake, hey, you voted against the union, but we're going to impose the union on you anyway. So that's kind of one of the main issues. It looks to stifle entrepreneurship and impose, if you remember what happened in California with their Assembly Bill 5 that tried to make most independent contractors employees.
Yeah, I remember that.
Even California said that went too far. The bill sponsor, the next, shortly thereafter, gave all these exemptions to the law, and then it went to the ballot, and there was even more exemptions. Well, unfortunately, the PRO Act is just that original law without any exemptions, and it would force, countless Americans into an employer-employee relationship without being able to work for themselves. So it's a tax on independent contracting. One of the other provisions, speaking of a tax, is it would devastate the franchise business model. That McDonald's on your street corner, that's not owned by McDonald's corporate. It is actually owned by a small mom and pop shop.
Oh, I didn't realize that.
What the PRO Act is trying to do is saying that the employees at that small mom and pop shop, that owner that is on the ground working directly with their employees, they're not just the one employer for those employees. It's actually McDonald's corporate or far distant corporation. And they're doing that, once again, to make unionization easier. But with all the liability and everything else that adds to that, you could see the franchise business model being absolutely devastated.
Because hold on. So it would mean that not only would you would buy a franchise from McDonald's, but, and I understand that comes with some restriction, like what you can sell, the kind of food, what you can serve and all this. But now it would also come with restrictions over what to do with your employees. So for instance, you couldn't pay them more if they needed to give them more vacation, or less or fewer, whatever. It would come, basically it would put even more string attached from buying a franchise then it.
If you could even buy the franchise. And I mean, there's people within the industry saying that because of the added liability of this joint, a joint employer relationship, that a lot of those individual franchise stores would essentially become like corporate owned. And you'd have, a business owner essentially turned into a mid-level manager. And the main impetus in that, divorce from, the boon for the trial, for trial attorneys would be to make unionization easier. So essentially the unions could go and strong arm one corporation as opposed to trying to organize store to store to store to store.
So what's the likelihood of, what's the prospect for the PRO Act?
It does not look good, thankfully, right now. The Senate it doesn't look like they have the votes in the Senate, and certainly they don't have the votes in the House. What I am more worried about is that, there's also a couple other provisions like stifling employer speech and other things like that within the PRO Act. And a lot of those provisions are being implemented, or the Biden administration is trying to implement them on a regulatory level. So, thankfully, the one thing in the PRO Act that they can't do regulatorily is the PRO Act tries to take away the right to work from the majority of states that enacted it. But, we've already seen the Department of Labor not do the exact same test as the PRO Act, but essentially have the same type of effect of stifling entrepreneurship with taking away a lot of workers' ability to work for themselves through their independent contractor regulation. Once again, more good news, though. The NLRB tried to do the same thing regulatorily through their joint employer rule. That's the franchise rule. And they were sued. They lost in court. And earlier this summer, they announced that they were dropping their appeal. So that is very good news. Now, unfortunately, now they're bringing other cases to try to impose it. But, they have now backed off of that rule. We're also seeing the NLRB trying to stifle employer speech. They call them captive audience meetings. Ooh, real scary sounding. Essentially, these are employee meetings on unionization where, employees during an all-staff meeting will talk to their employees about, hey, this is what we feel would happen if someone came between us in our relationship as the union. So unfortunately, what we are seeing, though, is the Biden administration, through the NLRB, through the Department of Labor, trying to administratively implement things in the PRO Act. But as far as the legislation itself, definitely for this Congress, we'll see what happens in November, likely dead on arrival. But the real worry is, once again, regulatorily in the administrative state.
You have a new study called Unions Need Democracy. I was shocked. And you wrote it with Akash Chuguli, whom I've had on this podcast to actually talk about, try to figure out what the Harris-Walz White House policies are and what they stand for. But in this study, you guys show that 90% of union workers, I think it's for the private sector, actually never voted for their unions. I mean, how is that possible?
It's about 95%. It's 94.9%.
What did I say? Okay, yeah, 95.
Yeah, never voted for their union. It's simply
crazy.
Think about it. If a lot of unions were organized, let's say in the 30s, 40s, or 50s, statistically, likely no one is still working at that plant or at that factory today that was there when the union was voted in. And there are methods such as union decertification, but they are incredibly difficult. So you see it as a combination of factors. First, many unions, especially the big ones and the big factories, organized, decades, almost a century ago. Then you also have this push towards card check, where, unions have organized a lot of workers where there was no vote. It was simply this open petition process, whether the worker was saying, I like the union, I want the union to get off my lawn, or I don't understand what I'm saying. They signed a card, the employer recognized them. That's how the union came in. There's also no quorum requirement when it comes to union elections. So, we've seen unions get elected with, a quarter of the workers voting. In fact, there's one case in California that, is still open. Both sides have raised objections, but the union could essentially win with only 11% of the workers voting for the union.
Is that the Starbucks case?
That's the Starbucks case, yeah.
Yeah, can you tell us? I mean, those numbers were crazy, if I remember. It was like 26 workers, like only 3 voted for or whatever, something like this.
That's right. So the case is still open. Both sides have raised objections, and this is, essentially going on 2 years old now, so we'll see what happens. But in the election, there was a unit of 28 workers, and 1 voted against the union, 3 voted for the union. And, depending on which way the NLRB rules, it's immaterial because no matter what happens, according to current labor law, those 3 workers could organize the 28. Even if those workers at this point aren't even at the store. It's, this small minority voted for the union, and there's nothing in law that says, well, you have to have, like NLRB has a 2/3 quorum for voting. And Representative Wahlberg actually just last month introduced the Worker Enfranchisement Act that would say, hey, if unions are organizing, they should have a quorum, not of workers voting for the union, but just workers showing up to vote. So we know that if the union has that monopoly, they, at least the majority of workers have had a say to bring the union in or not.
So I actually never really thought about it. But so when you join a company where the labor force is unionized, unless you're in a right to work state, you don't have a choice. You have to be part of the union and start paying fees, right?
You have to start paying fees. That's correct. You don't have to join the union. And this is where the unions say, oh, nobody has to be a union member. But if you're not in a right to work state, you have to pay the vast majority of your dues in what are known as agency fees. But even in right to work states, and this is what we were talking about before, the heart of the problem is that even in right to work states, you don't have to pay the union. You don't have to join, you don't have to pay, but you're still stuck under that union contract. You can't work directly with your boss. If you're doing a good job, you can't say, hey, I want an individual raise or I want a bonus, because even in right to work states, those workers are still stuck under the union contract. Now, unions will derogatively call them free riders because they say, oh, they're under the contract, they're not paying for it. I call them forced riders because they're forced under the union contract, whether they want to be or not.
Yeah. I mean, are the states that have adopted the right to work, are these states where they have a lot of union representation, or have they adopted it because it was actually low stake political fight because of the low worker representation? See what I mean?
It really depends on the states. The initial influx was, at the end of the 1940s. What the federal government then gave permission to the states to do this was in 1947 with the Taft-Hartley Act. Even a couple states like Virginia did it right before Taft-Hartley, and then you saw Russia states afterwards doing it. Recently, you saw, Midwestern states that were considered union strongholds pass right to work, such as Wisconsin, Indiana. Michigan passed it, but unfortunately, and, I love Michigan. I've worked with the Mackinac Center for years and lived in Michigan for years. And they unfortunately just repealed right to work. They had essentially Democrats had a 1-vote majority, and that was all they needed to take away workers' rights and take away our chairman's right, Terry Bowman, who lives in Michigan, his right to choose whether or not to support the UAW.
Yeah. What do you think? Was it last summer, like a year ago, where there were all these strikes about EV, electric vehicle, and because there's a big difference between EVs and regular cars, right? It requires much less lower skill work. I hate to say this because actually I think that a lot of what we call lower skill works require a ton of skills, but
I agree.
For lack of a better word, I mean, it's really, I don't even know what to say, but the debate was that a lot of the EV factories were actually kind of not really needing as many workers, right? That would be unionized otherwise, right? Did I remember that correctly?
You're correct. I believe that was a America First Policy Institute study that showed that for the amount of workers it takes to build a electric vehicle that's far less than the number of workers to build a conventional combustion engine vehicle. And the critique was that when the UAW was pushing for all these EV mandates and EV tax incentives and things like that, that they're actually harming their own membership.
Yeah, and then also there was an issue with like the factories that were opening as a result of the push for the EV mandates were also setting up in rights to work states, right?
Yes, and this is actually an issue that I've worked on very closely with the Mackinac Center. So with Mackinac, we worked in Tennessee, Alabama, and Georgia because, especially Tennessee, that's where Ford specifically was opening this huge EV complex, not even plant, massive complex. And it was found out that Ford has a card check agreement with the UAW. So once again, it would deprive those workers in Tennessee working at the Ford plant of the right to a secret ballot election to bring the UAW in or not. What Tennessee, Georgia, and Alabama did is, because there was some question, would they be able to do a secret ballot protection act for private sector employees, or is that covered under federal law? They simply said that if you're taking taxpayer incentives, and Tennessee gave a lot of money to Ford to come there, that as a condition of taking taxpayer incentives, you have to protect your workers. You have to protect their privacy, and you have to protect their right to a secret ballot. And, a lot of that was because this card check agreement that we saw in Tennessee. And then as the UAW was trying to organize in Georgia and Alabama, I know that the governors there saw that and said, we want to make sure that our workers are protected and not just our workers, but also job creators, because the main way that unions try to get card check, besides going through regulatory fiat or, things like the PRO Act, is that they strong arm companies and they do these really nasty anti-PR campaigns called corporate campaigns to try to drive away customers, harm the company, harm their reputation, harm their bottom line. And all of it will go away if the company agrees to card check, agreeing to not talk to their employees about what the union would do, and give the union, before they're required to, all of the company's employees, home contact information, home addresses, private cell phones, emails, and et cetera.
Wow, that's crazy. We don't have that much time left, so I have millions of more questions for you, but I want to actually have time to talk about reform ideas. You are not against workers being represented and even in their negotiation with their employers or union per se, but you're against the way unions are organized now. So what in your opinion needs to happen for us to have a healthy balance, basically?
Yeah, it's in our name. Institute for the American Worker. We are unabashedly pro-worker, and we believe in the rights of the individual worker to champion their own destiny, be free from government compulsion, be free from union compulsion. Frankly, we also believe in unions. And I think if unions give up the government-granted training wheels or the crutches and were voluntary professional service organizations, they could do a lot of good. As far as individual reform, just a couple of bills that we talked about. You have Representative Burleson's Workers' Choice bill that would allow workers to fully opt out of union representation, represent themselves. You have the ability of workers to hear both sides of the story. I think that would be a good reform. You have Representative Wahlberg's bill that would give more workers a say and say that unions shouldn't get a monopoly if they only have a small percentage of workers voting in an election. And of course, kind of the Republicans' answer to the PRO Act, to all the good ideas, is a bill called the Employee Rights Act that would protect the secret ballot. It would protect independent contracting. It would protect political choice by workers. It would protect the franchise business model and do other good things as well. So, those are just a few examples of current legislation that is out there to protect workers.
But so what would you say to someone who says, yeah, but all of these reforms, effectively, they're probably going to lead to fewer workers unionized. What would you tell them about, how actually unions could, without compulsion, entice workers to join them, right? To do something that they haven't actually had to do in decades, right? So how can union do a better job to actually, without the compulsion, kind of get people to want to join?
They need to change their business model. They need to become 21st century unions that embrace individual workers, that embrace individual contracts. And even if it's a floor, you don't have a ceiling. They need to give up those government granted training wheels, give up the compulsion, give up being able to force workers to accept their representation, and become professional service organizations. They can provide insurance. They can provide training. They can basically give the union seal of approval to their membership. All these things they can do without going through the current monopoly or exclusive representation. And I think that's how they appeal to workers. Unfortunately, that's not what they're doing. What we see with the PRO Act, what we see with the Biden administration, what we see with the political leanings is they are just simply doubling down from the failed business model of the past where, if we go back to the Industrial Revolution, if, the 30s or 40s come back around, and I'm actually paraphrasing a NPR commentator from Michigan, that unions will do a great job, but those years aren't coming back. And they have to adapt. And until they do, I think they're going to continue to see their decline.
So we need like a mind shift, because like right now, unions are operating under a model that pretty much believes that workers have no choice, and that employers are going to be abusing their employees, and that without kind of this confrontation, nothing's going to happen. When you actually look at wage growth and all the benefits, in fact, I think benefits actually is putting a damper on wage growth, because unfortunately, this is something that I just keep telling people and they just don't understand it, is that the more benefits you want, the more you're going to be actually reducing how much, wages you're going to be getting. But that I'm not getting through this with people. But so we just really need we need to kind of convince people that actually workers are actually doing really well, and that they'd be doing even better if they could join unions that would serve them and give them, what they want. Like, for instance, training, right? That could be a function. I can imagine that they could do that really well, or certification especially for independent contractors. I would think that there would be a big demand. If you're an electrician, right? And if you've kind of gotten the seal of approval of the training of a particular association, that should be really a big service.
No, that's right. I mean, just think about, if you go to a mechanic, you look for the ACE, certificate on the wall. Okay, they've gone through this training, they've passed these tests. I know if they're working on my brakes, I can trust them. That's something that, ACE is not mandatory. But, as a consumer, I look to that and know that, okay, I can rest easy. This person knows what they're doing. I mean, unions can do the same thing. As long as it's not mandatory, as long as government isn't giving them a monopoly or forcing workers to go through their training or go through their certificates, as long as they're saying that consumers, don't have to only buy through them, then yeah, I think that is one of the big ways forward.
Okay. Well, we're going to have to stop here. Thank you so much, Vinnie.
Hey, thanks for having me on. And if your listeners want to learn more, we are at Institute for the American Worker, I4AW.org, I4AW.org.
Yeah, and go check that latest study, The Unions Need Democracy. It's really interesting. Thank you.
Hey, thanks for having me on.